This is a video about Ohm's law, and we'll cover what Ohm's law is, how to use the Ohm's law triangle, how to apply Ohm's law, how to take advantage of Ohm's law's proportionality, and an example of how it can be useful in the field. What is Ohm's law and why is it useful? Ohm's law describes the relationship between voltage, current, and resistance in an electric circuit. As it turns out, all three of these values are proportional to one another, and either one of them can be found if you know what the other two values are. So how do you use Ohm's law? Using the Ohm's law triangle, here, one can find the voltage given the current and the resistance, or the current given the voltage and resistance, or the resistance given the voltage and the current. To find voltage, you can simply cover up this V and multiply I times R. To find resistance, you can cover up this R and you have voltage divided by current. To find current, you can cover up this I and you have voltage divided by resistance. Here are some examples. Suppose you have a 240 volt source and a 10 ohm heating element in a circuit. If you wanted to find the current, you would cover up the I on the Ohm's law triangle and you would have voltage divided by resistance. Thus, you would have 240 volts divided by 10 ohms for a current of 24 amps. What if you knew the current and the resistance, but not the voltage? You would cover up the V on the Ohm's law triangle and multiply the resistance by the current, which would be 10 ohms times 24 amps or 240 volts. If you knew only the voltage and the current, you could find the resistance by covering up the R on the triangle, and you would have 240 volts divided by 24 amps, or 10 ohms. With Ohm's law, you can not only predict the behavior of a circuit given its voltage, current, or resistance, but also predict what would happen if you were to change any of those values. This is because of Ohm's law's proportional relationship between voltage, current, and resistance. Thus, if you were to double the resistance in a circuit, you would cut the current in half. If you were to double the voltage, you would double the current. If you were to cut the current in half, but leave the voltage unchanged, you would have to double the resistance. Let's see a few examples. Based on the last example with a 240 volt source and a 10 ohm heating element, we can predict what would happen if you were to increase or decrease the voltage, current, or resistance. For example, if we double the voltage, we know that since voltage is in the numerator of the equation, that current must also double. So if we were to double the voltage from the previous example from 240 to 480 volts and divide that by 10 ohms, we would have 48 amps, which is twice the amount of current from the previous example. Likewise, if we were to double the resistance, we know that since it is in the denominator of the Ohm's law triangle, that current would be cut in half. Let's try that. So in the original example, we had 240 volts and 10 ohms in the circuit. If you were to double the resistance, you would have 20 ohms. If you take 240 volts and divide that by 20 ohms, you're going to have 12 amps flowing through the circuit, which is 1/2 of the original current. What is an example of using Ohm's law in the field? Suppose you have an electric dryer that is taking too long to dry. You know that the heat circuit is supplied by the voltage between line 1 and line 2, or 240 volts. If you monitor the current on the L2 line, you can read the current through that heat circuit, and thus the element. You know that the resistance of the element is about 10 ohms. Thus, using Ohm's law, you can determine what the expected current through L2 is by using I equals E over R, or I equals 240 volts divided by 10 ohms, or 24 amps. When you check the current through L2, you get 17 amps though. This means that the total resistance of the heat circuit, instead of being 10 ohms, is actually, using Ohm's law again, R equals E divided by I, or 240 volts divided by 17 amps, or 14 ohms. This means that you have some unwanted resistance somewhere in that circuit that is reducing the circuit current and robbing the element of some of its needed voltage. You inspect the terminal block and realize that there's a loose connection on the L2 line. After repairing it, you read 24 amps through L2 and the dryer heats fine. You can be assured that you found the problem by going a step further and determining that the power output of the element with a loose terminal block was P equals I squared R, or 17 amps squared times the 10 ohms of the element, or 2890 watts. But the amount of power that you were expecting would have been 24 amps squared times 10 ohms, or 5760 watts. This means that with the loose terminal block, the heating element was only outputting 50% as much heat as it should have been. By the way, there is a link to the video on electric power in the description of this video. So that was just one of many examples of how Ohm's law can help you with your diagnosis. That's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative. If so, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel.